Hey guys, tonight we're diving into a topic that's going to make you question the very nature of what we call civilization. I mean, could there be anything more bizarre than the idea of eating human flesh being considered a miracle cure? Imagine this, a brown powder, ground from mummified human bodies, mixed into drinks, made into salves, or even consumed straight up. Sounds like something out of a horror movie. Right, but believe it or not, this wasn't some weird myth. It was a medical practice in 15th century Europe. You probably won't survive this, but let's take a wild ride through history and see how far humanity went with this whole eating people for health thing. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Also, drop where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Let's start our exploration with an absolutely bizarre phenomenon that gripped Europe during the 15th century. It was a time of great discoveries, but also of horrific misunderstandings about medicine. If you'd lived back then, your physician might have recommended something truly jaw-dropping, a powder made from human mummies to cure everything from epilepsy to bruising to nausea. You heard that right, mummified human flesh, ground into powder, was sold as a universal cure. The remedy was called mumia, and it wasn't just some Dark Ages urban legend. It was a genuine, accepted treatment at the time. The belief in medicinal cannibalism was so widespread that even doctors and scholars, who would later lay the foundation for modern medical practices, embraced it. How did this happen? Well, ancient Egypt had this treasure trove of preserved mummies, and somehow, in the medieval mind, this preserved flesh was believed to hold magical properties. The thought was that the mummification process, which preserved the body for the afterlife, also preserved the healing powers of the deceased. It's like they thought the dead had some kind of supernatural first aid kit that could fix anything from mental illness to a simple headache. Now, we can laugh about it today, but back then, people actually believed this. And it wasn't just a passing trend, it went on for centuries. It got so popular that by the 16th century, mummies were being stolen from tombs across Europe and Egypt to meet the rising demand. Imagine the shock of a family member opening their ancestor's tomb, only to find it's been raided for medicine. If that doesn't give you the chills, I don't know what will. Historians still argue whether this practice was based on any factual medical reasoning, or if it was pure superstition. It's difficult to say how much actual medical benefit was believed to come from mumia, but we do know that the practice had widespread support from the medical community at the time, and when demand outstripped the availability of Egyptian mummies. Opportunistic thieves started raiding European cemeteries for bodies to grind into powder. The human body became both a commodity and a cure-all in the darkest corners of medieval Europe. But it wasn't just about mummies. Oh no, this trend ran much deeper. Blood, liver, and even brains were used in various medicinal concoctions. If you had an ailment, it wasn't unheard of to have human body parts served up in some form of healing brew, as strange as it sounds. The practice of using human remains in medical treatments persisted well into the 18th century. If you were dealing with something like epilepsy, chances were that your doctor might have suggested that you take a bit of human blood. Yes, blood straight from a human body. And while that seems absurd to us today, back then, it wasn't even the strangest thing happening in medical circles. There were also medical mixtures made from human hearts, gallstones, and, believe it or not, powdered human skulls. Now, let's add a twist. Imagine you're a person in the 15th century. You've heard all these wild tales about the healing powers of mumia, and you're feeling a little under the weather. You go to your local apothecary, and there it is, displayed like the most precious of potions, a jar of mumia powder, so finely ground, it almost looks like a rare spice. You take it, mix it with wine, or maybe rub it into your skin as a salve. Not just for a rash, but for pretty much everything: cramps, bruises, even emotional pain. It's like some kind of ancient miracle drug that's supposed to fix all your problems. Of course, you don't know that what you're using is, well, human flesh. Here's the kicker: this practice was so ingrained in the culture that it didn't even raise eyebrows. People didn't question whether or not this was ethical. They were too busy chasing after the next cure. The belief in the powers of mumia wasn't some small, fringe idea. It was widely accepted by the upper class, and even by royalty. Yes, royal physicians were often the ones prescribing such treatments. And while we might scoff at this today, back then, it wasn't considered bizarre. It was part of the fabric of how people understood illness and healing. But let's pause for a moment and take a step back. Why would anyone think that human flesh could heal them? Well, it all comes down to a concept that's hard to wrap our minds around: the idea that consuming a piece of someone else could transfer their power or vitality to you. It's kind of like that modern idea where people take supplements or vitamins from certain animals thinking that the traits of those animals will somehow benefit them. Only in this case, people were hoping that by ingesting human remains, they would be able to absorb some kind of magical, life-giving force. It's wild, right? And then there's the social and cultural context to consider. In the 15th century, people were living in a world of immense uncertainty. Plague, famine, and warfare were rampant, and medical knowledge was rudimentary at best. So, when the opportunity to get cured by something as exotic and mysterious as mummy powder came along, it was easy to understand why people were willing to believe in it. After all, the idea of using human remains as a medicine wasn't as absurd as it seems. In some cultures, the use of body parts for ritual and healing had been practiced for centuries. For example, the ancient Aztecs used human sacrifice as part of their religious rituals, believing that it was necessary to feed the gods and maintain cosmic balance. So, in a strange way, Europe's embrace of medicinal cannibalism wasn't completely out of left field. It was just, well, more bizarre and probably less effective. But I digress. Back to mumia. As the demand grew and bodies became scarce, you'd think that the practice would eventually die out. But no. The craze didn't just fade away quietly. It continued for centuries, even well into the 18th century. Mumia was still listed as an acceptable medical remedy in certain apothecaries and physicians' catalogues. And remember, this was the time when the scientific revolution was beginning to take hold. Think about it, this practice survived all the way through the Enlightenment, when modern science was starting to question everything except, apparently, the benefits of grinding up dead people for medicine. Historians still debate the full extent of how widely mumia was used, but there's no denying that it had an impact. Some argue that it was used far more than we think, while others contend that it was just a brief fad that became overhyped. Either way, it's a bizarre chapter in the history of medicine, and it raises a lot of questions about how easily people can become convinced by something that sounds both logical and completely ludicrous at the same time. Now, let's wrap this up and transition to what happens next in this strange tale. You've learned that mumia was a hot commodity in 15th century Europe, but how did it fit into a larger pattern of cultural practices and beliefs about death, the body, and the afterlife? What happens when a society's desperation for a cure leads them to cross a line they never thought they'd cross? And what about the people who profited from selling human remains for medical purposes? How did they get away with it? Let's dive into these questions as we continue our journey through history, and you'll see how deeply embedded cannibalism became in the fabric of European life. Now that you've gotten a glimpse into the dark side of medieval European medicine, let's shift gears a bit. Let's look at the word cannibal, a term that was coined during the time of Christopher Columbus. Yes, the very same Columbus who sailed across the ocean, blue in 1492. But what does Columbus have to do with cannibalism? Well, in the 15th century, explorers were discovering new lands and, with that, new cultures, and sometimes, when you discover something, you also discover a way to dehumanize it. Imagine this, you're Columbus, and you've just landed on the island of Guadeloupe. You've been travelling for weeks, and finally set foot on this strange, new land, only to encounter the indigenous people, initially. Columbus sends back reports to the Queen of Spain, claiming that the people there are friendly and peaceful. But then, he hears a rumour. There's a group of people who we know now as the Caribs, who aren't exactly so friendly. According to Columbus, these Caribs were notorious for making violent raids, capturing prisoners, and then eating them. Yes, it's a shocking image, but here's where things start to get a little fishy. Columbus, who was looking for gold and riches, had his own agenda. It wasn't long before Columbus began to label anyone who resisted his plundering and kidnapping as Caribs. And, of course, if someone was labelled a Carib, that meant they could be enslaved and killed with impunity. Now, you might be thinking, wait a second, that sounds a little too convenient. Historians still argue whether Columbus's portrayal of the indigenous people was accurate or just an excuse to justify further conquest and violence. After all, Columbus didn't find the gold he was looking for. What he found instead were lands full of people. And how convenient was it for him to claim that these people were dangerous cannibals, thus justifying the kidnapping, slavery, and brutal treatment of indigenous communities. That's right, what began as a rumour from Columbus's exploration turned into a tool for colonisation. At some point, the word Carib morphed into cannibay and then eventually into cannibal. That's right, the word we now associate with people who eat human flesh started as a racial slur. It was used as a way to dehumanise indigenous people and justify their exploitation. Historians are still debating whether the Caribs truly practiced cannibalism, or if it was a convenient label used by colonisers to demonise them. But what we do know for sure is that the term cannibal has a very ugly and racist origin, and it's rooted in the way colonisers twisted the truth to serve their own agendas. But let's pause for a moment and ask ourselves, why was cannibalism so central to how colonisers saw the indigenous people? Why did the idea of eating humans become the symbol of their supposed barbarity? It's like the colonisers were saying, we're superior because we don't eat people, which was just as absurd as it sounds. But this idea, whether based on fact or not, became deeply embedded in the way Europeans viewed the New World. It's like that one friend who insists that their weird hobby is better than yours. Except in this case, the hobby was the practice of eating other humans for medical or ritualistic reasons. And what's even more bizarre is that even though the term cannibal was being used to vilify indigenous cultures, it was a term that European societies were also intimately familiar with, if only on a different level. You see, cannibalism had been practiced in Europe for centuries, but it wasn't as outwardly acknowledged. It took a more subtle and insidious form, one that was steeped in medicine, death, and a dark history of rituals that involved the consumption of human flesh. Take, for example, the use of mumia in European medicine. as we discussed earlier. Mumia ground-up mummies was used as a treatment for a variety of ailments. In a time when medical knowledge was rudimentary and disease was seen as something mysterious and divine. The idea of using human remains as a form of healing made a strange kind of sense to the people living back then. But what gets really disturbing is how this practice of medicinal cannibalism didn't just stop at mummies from ancient Egypt. As demand grew for this miracle cure, opportunists started to raid European cemeteries, stealing freshly buried bodies to grind into powder and sell as medicine. In a way, they were cannibals too, albeit in a much less obvious way. The use of human remains as medicine wasn't just a passing trend. It went on for centuries, well into the 17th and even the early 18th centuries. Yes, you heard that right. Mumia was still being used in European medical circles well into the 1600s. Long after the initial craze had started, it wasn't just mumia, no, that would be too simple. European medical professionals also used human blood, liver, and brain tissue as part of their treatments. There were even reports of using powdered human hearts to treat various illnesses. The strange thing about this whole practice is that it wasn't hidden in dark alleyways or secret societies. It was marketed, sold, and even listed in medical encyclopedias. Can you imagine going to your local apothecary, asking for a remedy for your illness, and being handed a jar of pulverized human skull? That was the reality of medieval Europe. Historians have spent centuries trying to understand why Europeans were so fascinated by cannibalism during the Middle Ages. Was it because they thought consuming human flesh would somehow transfer the vitality of the deceased into their own bodies? Or was it because they believed that by ingesting the remains of someone who had lived a life of honour or strength, they could absorb those qualities? Historians still argue about the true motivation behind medicinal cannibalism. But the fact remains that it was widespread and accepted at the time. And while it might seem absurd to us today, for the people who lived in those times, it was just another part of life. As we move forward in this tale, let's take a look at some of the more bizarre practices of cannibalism that arose out of desperation. It wasn't always about medicine or ritual, sometimes. It was about survival. Imagine being caught in the middle of a siege, with no food, no hope, and no way to survive unless you were willing to do the unthinkable. Survival cannibalism became a very real and disturbing way for people to stay alive during some of Europe's darkest moments. And in those moments, the line between life and death was blurred in ways that are hard for us to understand today. So, grab your medieval survival gear and get ready to dive deeper into the world of cannibalism. But don't worry, this journey through history is going to be a lot more than just gruesome details. We're here to understand not just the macabre practices of the past, but also the larger picture of how and why humanity has turned to such extreme measures in times of crisis. Now that you've gotten a taste of how cannibalism creeped its way into European medicine, and how the word itself became a tool for racial dehumanization, let's shift our focus to another odd and sometimes chilling aspect of European cannibalism: survival cannibalism. Yes, the kind that happens when you're stuck in a dire situation with no food, like being stranded on a snow-covered mountain or trapped on a ship in the middle of the ocean. It's one thing to grind up mummies for medicinal purposes, but it's another to take the drastic step of actually eating people to stay alive. And while this might sound like something out of a horror movie, it's a practice that has an unsettling history throughout Europe, especially in times of famine, war and disaster. Let's start by talking about the infamous famine winters of the Middle Ages. Picture this: the year is 1315 and Europe is in the middle of one of its worst famines in recorded history. Crops have failed, the climate is colder than usual, and there's no grain to make bread. The population is starving, and desperation is starting to set in. People are eating whatever they can get their hands on: leather, roots, even bark from trees. But for some, even this wasn't enough to stave off the gnawing hunger. As the famine drags on and the situation worsens, stories start to surface of people turning to the unthinkable cannibalism. Historians still argue about the extent of cannibalism during this time, but it's clear that it was happening. One of the most famous cases of survival cannibalism took place in the 16th century. During a disaster that's both haunting and morbidly fascinating. The Donner Party, a group of American pioneers who set out to cross the Sierra Nevada mountains, got trapped in the winter of 1846, with food supplies exhausted and no way to escape. Some members of the group resorted to eating the bodies of the deceased to survive. It was a terrible, horrifying decision, and it shows just how far people will go when pushed to the edge. But what's chilling is that such events weren't isolated. Similar stories crop up throughout history, especially when people found themselves isolated in extreme conditions, with no other option to survive. In Europe, the idea of cannibalism wasn't just limited to famine, though during sieges, especially in the medieval period, when entire cities were surrounded by enemy forces, people would often be trapped for weeks, even months, without access to food. The most infamous example of this occurred in 1317 during the siege of a city in what is now France. The defenders of the city were trapped by an enemy army, and as time passed, the food supply ran out. Hunger became unbearable, and it wasn't long before some began to eat the bodies of the dead. While historians still argue over how widespread the practice was, one thing is certain: the desperation to survive can drive people to unimaginable lengths. But cannibalism wasn't always about survival in these extreme situations. In some cases, it was embedded in the very culture of certain societies, so normalised that it wasn't viewed with the same level of horror we feel today. Some cultures practice ritualistic cannibalism, where eating the flesh of the dead wasn't about hunger, it was about power, respect, or even love. Take the example of funerary cannibalism in Europe, which was practiced in certain areas as a way to honour the deceased. The most famous example of this comes from the Four People in New Guinea, but it was present in other parts of the world as well, including parts of medieval Europe. Imagine this: you're attending a funeral, and instead of simply burying the body, the family and friends of the deceased gather to consume the remains. It wasn't done out of necessity, but as a symbolic act, a way to keep the spirit of the dead alive. In some cultures, it was believed that by consuming the deceased, you could absorb their strength, wisdom, or spirit. It wasn't cannibalism as we think of it today. It was a ritual, a means of preserving the connection with the dead. Yet, there's a darker side to this as well. In medieval Europe, the practice of consuming human flesh was sometimes tied to the belief that it could provide medicinal benefits if you were ill. It wasn't unheard of to ingest human body parts, such as blood, liver, or even pulverized bones, as a way to heal yourself. This practice wasn't confined to the uneducated or the lower classes either. Even wealthy individuals and doctors took part in these practices, often with the belief that they were receiving a divine gift. Blood, for example, was seen as the essence of life, and consuming it was thought to invigorate the drinker. It's not just a horror story, it's the reality of medical practices in a time when science and medicine were in their infancy, and superstition reigned supreme. But we're not done yet. The practice of eating human flesh during a crisis was not only limited to Europe. You might be surprised to learn that this strange practice continued for centuries after the medieval period, especially in times of war and siege. The 16th and 17th centuries saw a rise in warfare, and with it, a rise in the number of people turning to cannibalism when the situation became dire. Imagine being in the midst of battle, with no hope of food, surrounded by dead bodies, many of which were soldiers from your own side. If survival meant eating flesh, would you do it? One of the most dramatic examples of this occurred in the 1600s during the siege of Magdeburg, a city in what is now Germany. The city was under siege for months by Swedish forces during the 30 Years' War. As food became scarce, people began to resort to the unthinkable. Bodies of the dead were dug up and eaten, and those still living began to starve and die in horrific numbers. The stories of cannibalism spread like wildfire, and though there were many who survived, the trauma and horror of what they had witnessed haunted them for the rest of their lives. Even after the siege ended, the memories of what people had done to stay alive lingered. Historians still debate the extent to which cannibalism was practiced during these sieges and famines. But what is clear is that survival cannibalism was a horrific reality for many during these dark times. It wasn't just a rare, isolated incident, it was part of the tragic human experience when faced with the most extreme conditions. And what's even more unsettling is the way that people, faced with starvation and death, justified these acts to themselves. It wasn't just a matter of desperation, it was survival. You can only imagine how that would change your perception of the world if you found yourself in a situation where the only choice was to consume another human being. But let's not forget that these acts of cannibalism weren't just limited to medieval and early modern Europe. The idea of eating human flesh as a survival mechanism has been present in every corner of the world, from the Americas to Africa to the Far East. And even though the practice was far more common in times of war or famine, there have been instances of it cropping up in peacetime as well. But the fact remains that, despite all the justifications, the act of consuming another human being, whether for survival, ritual, or medicine, has always been met with a mixture of fascination and revulsion. As we move forward, we'll take a closer look at how the more medicinal use of human flesh morphed into a centuries-long practice. It's one thing to consume the dead as a means of survival, but it's another to grind up their bones and use them as medicine. Just how far did this practice go? How far did people push the boundaries of what was acceptable in the name of healing now? After trudging through the ghastly practices of survival cannibalism in European history, let's dive a little deeper into the medicinal side of this macabre tale. Sure, eating the dead when you're stuck in a snowy mountain pass is one thing, but what if you were to grind up their bones that have long since dried and crumbled under the weight of time, and mix it into your soup as medicine? If the thought of that makes your stomach churn, it's time to buckle up, because you're about to hear about one of the most bizarre, yet shockingly widespread, practices in medieval and early modern European medicine: mumia. What is mumia? You ask, oh, you're in for a treat or not, depending on how you look at it. Mumia was a powdered substance that became a miraculous cure-all in Europe during the 15th century. And by miraculous, I mean it was purported to heal everything from epilepsy to bruising to hemorrhages. Sounds great. Right. Well, here's the kicker: it was made by grinding up mummified human flesh. Yes, you heard that correctly. That stuff in the museum, those ancient mummies wrapped in linen, whose wrinkled faces stare out of glass cases. Well, people once believed that by grinding their bodies into fine powder and mixing it into potions, they could rid themselves of various ailments. Now, before you start picturing medieval doctors walking around with powdered mummy jars as if they were a hot new spice, let's get into how this gruesome practice came about. It wasn't just an isolated incident of a few rogue healers going off the rails. No, this was part of the medical mainstream in many parts of Europe, stretching from Italy to France to England, and it lasted for hundreds of years. In fact, the use of mumia was so widespread that it made its way into the Merck Index, a widely referenced medical encyclopedia, even into the 20th century. But how did this all start? You can thank the ancient Egyptians for this one. Well, sort of. See, the first people to use mumia were actually ancient Egyptians themselves. But not in the way Europeans would later do. The Egyptians used a type of resin to preserve the dead, a practice which they believed ensured the soul's immortality. When European traders and travellers encountered mummified bodies in Egypt, they noticed something curious. The preserved bodies and their resins had a unique, almost medicinal smell. The Europeans, having no qualms about pushing the boundaries of alternative medicine, took a leap and started grinding up actual mummies to make a powder they believed would cure diseases. Now, this whole mumia craze didn't happen overnight. The first signs of mumia's rise to popularity can be traced back to the 14th century, when people began to use the remains of ancient Egyptian mummies as a sort of exotic remedy. Initially, it was believed that the resin used in embalming processes held miraculous healing powers. But then, as the demand for these magical substances grew, the original mummies couldn't be sourced fast enough to meet the European market. So, enter the opportunists, the grave robbers, the plundering adventurers, and even the local villagers, who began raiding cemeteries to supply the growing demand for mumia. European physicians didn't mind, of course, because as long as it worked, it was worth it, right? This, of course, led to a booming underground industry where stolen bodies were ground into powder and sold as a miracle cure. And it wasn't just any body that would do. The high demand for mumia led to the search for better quality specimens, with some people even believing that the older the mummy, the more potent the cure. It was the perfect storm of medical ignorance and greed, not to mention, by this point, mummies weren't just coming from Egypt, they were also taken from Europe. When Egyptian mummies were in short supply, bodies from European graveyards were ground into the magical powder. But let's not think for a second that mumia's medicinal properties were confined to the wackier fringes of society. Oh no, these potions and remedies were widely accepted in Europe. People of all classes, from nobility to peasants, were swallowing powdered mummies in the hope of curing whatever ailed them. And it wasn't just one specific ailment that this magical powder was meant to fix. Oh no, mumia was believed to be a cure-all. Headaches, mumia, joint pain, mumia, bruises or wounds that wouldn't heal. You guessed it, mumia. It was the medieval version of a one-size-fits-all remedy, only with a much darker and more revolting twist. But don't think that mumia's popularity was just some sort of misguided, but ultimately harmless craze. Oh no, mumia wasn't merely an eccentricity. It had actual societal consequences. At its height, mumia was used so commonly that it became an integral part of European medical culture. In fact, the powder was often prescribed by doctors and used in apothecaries' remedies, alongside other equally bizarre concoctions, like powdered animal hearts, brain oil, or human blood. And if you didn't have access to actual mummy powder, there were always substitutes. Some unscrupulous dealers in the black market would mix regular powdered bones and pass them off as authentic mumia. So, as you can imagine, the market for body parts was lucrative. People were turning a profit by selling stolen body parts in powdered form. And as if all of that wasn't disturbing enough, let's take a moment to talk about the common practice of bloodletting and how it ties into this whole messy web of early European medicinal practices. Bloodletting was another practice that went hand in hand with mumia use, though in a slightly less gruesome manner. Bloodletting was thought to restore balance to the body by removing excess blood and balancing the humours. Some physicians recommended bloodletting for ailments like epilepsy or even mild fevers. Of course, as you might expect, bloodletting often resulted in more harm than good, but there was a widespread belief in the necessity of this practice, especially in the medieval period. In fact, many doctors and healers of the time thought that keeping the humours of the body, blood, bile, and phlegm in balance was the key to staying healthy. You might laugh now, but back then, this was cutting-edge science. The medical world of medieval Europe was a confusing and contradictory place, where beliefs about the human body were often based more on theory and superstition than on evidence. And don't even get me started on the doctors who might have also been peddling mumia to unsuspecting patients as a cure for everything under the sun, just because it was fashionable and exotic. Even with the eventual advent of more modern medicine in the 17th and 18th centuries, mumia's grip on European medical culture persisted. In fact, mumia continued to be used well into the 19th century, although by then, people were more likely to question its effectiveness. Still, some doctors were reluctant to part ways with this historical remedy. Despite mounting evidence that it did little to improve health, people were stubborn back then. They had invested too much in these miracle cures to let them go easily. But what was it about mumia that captured the imagination of so many people? Was it the exotic allure of ancient Egypt? Was it the mystical appeal of using substances linked to the afterlife and divine powers, or was it simply a result of an era where medicine was still a strange mix of science, superstition and trial and error? Historians still debate the exact role that mumia played in European medical history. Some see it as a fascinating chapter of superstition and ignorance, while others argue that it represents the early attempts at scientific inquiry. But no matter how you spin it, one thing is certain: the practice of grinding up human remains to make medicine is one of the creepiest and most bizarre aspects of European medical history. And while we may look back with horror and disbelief at the idea of consuming powdered mummies, it's a reminder of how much medical practices have evolved and how lucky we are to have better options today. So, while you're digesting this grim historical tidbit, remember that cannibalism in medicine didn't end with mumia. No, this practice morphed into something even stranger. And we're about to delve deeper into just how far the human appetite for the extraordinary and the grotesque was pushed. Now that we've been sufficiently disturbed by the practice of mumia and the lengths Europeans went to in search of miraculous remedies, it's time to turn our attention to another horrifying chapter in the history of medicinal cannibalism, one that involves the eating of actual human flesh for its healing properties. Yes, you read that right. As if grinding up mummies wasn't strange enough, people actually consumed the flesh of the dead, convinced that it would cure them of all manner of ailments. This was not some fringe activity practiced by a few rogue individuals. Either it was mainstream for centuries, ingrained in the medical practices of Europe. To understand how this came to pass, we need to take a step back and look at the broader context of how ancient and medieval Europeans viewed illness and health. You see, in those days, disease wasn't just something that happened because of bacteria, viruses, or bad luck. No, illness was often seen as a punishment or as the result of a spiritual imbalance. In fact, for much of history, people believed that a lack of harmony between the body and the divine could lead to sickness. It wasn't uncommon for people to seek out not just physical cures, but spiritual ones as well. And what better way to address this imbalance than by consuming the flesh of the deceased, something that would, in theory, reconnect them with life, vitality, and the gods. Let's start with the most famous example, blood. Yes, blood, that most vital of substances, was used for all sorts of medical purposes, and it wasn't just any blood, it had to be human blood. Physicians in medieval Europe would often prescribe drinking the blood of executed criminals as a cure for ailments like epilepsy or even mental illness. The theory was that the blood of a freshly executed person had a certain potency, perhaps because it was linked to the life force, or because it had been purified through the process of death. But the use of blood didn't stop there. As the demand for human flesh-based remedies grew, so did the list of bodily parts that were believed to have curative properties. Among these were human livers, gallstones, brains, and hearts. Can you imagine a doctor prescribing a nice steak made from someone's liver to cure your chronic headaches? It sounds absurd today, but this was once reality in certain parts of Europe, particularly during the Renaissance. There are documented cases of people eating human flesh as a treatment for everything from fever to trauma. Even more disturbingly, in some instances, the body parts were consumed raw, as people believed that the vital force was retained in the tissue before it was cooked. Cooking, after all, could be seen as a process that removed the essence of life, weakening its potency. So, to truly harness the healing properties of the body, it had to be consumed in its most primal form. But let's not get too bogged down in the gruesome details. The reality is that these practices were tied to some deeply ingrained ideas about life, death, and the human body. In the medieval mindset, death wasn't the end, it was simply a transition to another state of being, to the living. The body of the dead was a resource, one that could be used for healing, spiritual cleansing, or even as a way to harness the power of the deceased spirit, the consumption of human flesh. While horrifying to us today, was seen as an act that could help bridge the gap between the living and the dead, between suffering and healing. And while we're on the topic of cannibalism in Europe, let's not forget about the darker side of medieval warfare. If the idea of consuming human flesh to cure disease wasn't unsettling enough, you can imagine how much more disturbing it becomes when we consider the practice of cannibalism in times of war or siege, during medieval sieges, when food was scarce and survival was at stake. The consumption of human flesh wasn't just a medical practice, it became a desperate survival tactic. Soldiers and civilians alike, trapped in besieged cities or on the battlefield, resorted to cannibalism as a way to stay alive when all other food sources had been exhausted. This kind of cannibalism wasn't restricted to ancient or medieval times, either, while it may seem like a brutal relic of the past. Reports of survival cannibalism still surface in the modern era, particularly in situations where people are stranded or caught in extreme circumstances. But it's not just the physical desperation that makes these acts of cannibalism so disturbing, it's the psychological toll they take. The act of eating another human being, even in the direst of circumstances, can lead to a profound sense of guilt, trauma, and dehumanization. And that's the tragedy of survival cannibalism. It's not just about physical survival, but about what it does to the psyche of those who partake in it. Now, let's pause for a moment and reflect on the strange intersection of morality, survival, and medical belief that we've just uncovered. What does it say about the human condition when people believe that consuming human flesh could cure their ailments? It speaks to the lengths to which people will go when faced with illness, poverty, and desperation. It speaks to the belief that the body, alive or dead, holds powers that can transcend the physical world, and it speaks to the darkness that resides within human nature that, when pushed to the limit, can resort to such unimaginable practices, and yet, even in the face of such horror, there's a certain sense of fascination that draws us to these historical stories. Perhaps it's the grotesque allure of something so foreign to our modern sensibilities. Perhaps it's the reminder that, in many ways, our understanding of health, morality, and survival is shaped not just by science, but by culture, superstition, and the circumstance in which we find ourselves. But let's not get too lost in the philosophical implications of all this. The history of medicinal cannibalism in Europe is a strange, tangled web of facts, myths, and human behaviour at its most extreme. It's a reminder that medicine, for all its advances, has often been a messy and often barbaric practice. And while we may look back at these practices with disgust, it's important to remember that they were, at the time, seen as legitimate attempts to alleviate suffering. They were a product of their time, a time when the boundaries between science, superstition, and survival were often blurred. But we're not done yet. As we continue our journey through this macabre history, we'll uncover even more strange and unsettling practices, ones that reveal just how deeply cannibalism was woven into the fabric of human history. But don't worry, it's not all dark and grim. Along the way, we'll find moments of humour and absurdity as we continue to unravel the strange and twisted legacy of human cannibalism. It might be a bit much to stomach, but as we continue our journey into the eerie world of human cannibalism in European history, we're going to look at how this horrific practice didn't just exist in the shadows. Oh no, it was actually endorsed by some of the most revered figures in medicine. Let that sink in for a moment. Cannibalism was once seen as a legitimate treatment in certain European circles, practiced by trained physicians and even mentioned in medical texts. It's almost as if the medieval medical community was locked in a race to find the most bizarre and grotesque cure for every ailment under the sun. Let's dive into the fascinating and frankly unsettling world of medicinal cannibalism, which was particularly common from the 16th to the 18th century. During this time, consuming human body parts for medicinal purposes was believed to hold extraordinary healing potential. As ridiculous as it sounds, many respected doctors, apothecaries, and physicians actually prescribed powdered human remains, blood, fat, and other bodily materials to treat a wide range of illnesses. It wasn't even a fringe idea. Dismissed by most, it was a mainstream practice. So, let's talk about the specifics. One of the most infamous substances used in these treatments was human blood. Don't cringe just yet. Medieval and Renaissance doctors believed that drinking the blood of a freshly executed criminal would cure a variety of ailments, including epilepsy, fever, and even mental illnesses. It was thought that consuming the blood of someone who had just been put to death was particularly powerful because it was believed to contain a person's vital force, their life energy. So, the more fresh the blood, the more potent the healing effects. And what better way to obtain this precious resource than from public executions? They were a grimly convenient source of medicine. But this wasn't just about blood. You've probably guessed it by now. Human flesh was also used in an array of treatments. The idea of cannibalism as medicine didn't just stop with drinking blood. No, there were all sorts of body parts used as ingredients for various remedies. Human fat, for instance, was a popular item on the medicinal menu. It was thought to be a cure for a wide range of conditions, from cuts and bruises to more serious ailments. Fat was often rendered and applied topically as an ointment or salve, while powdered remains of human bones and flesh were sometimes mixed into concoctions that were ingested. At this point, you're probably wondering, how could anyone justify consuming human body parts for medicinal purposes? It sounds barbaric, and that's because it was. But back then, there was little distinction between superstition and science. Physicians worked under the assumption that the human body was a deeply interconnected system, both physically and spiritually. They believed that by consuming parts of another human being, they could absorb the life force or spiritual essence of the dead, and, in doing so, restore balance to their own body. And of course, death was a deeply spiritual event in those days, so any part of the dead body was thought to be infused with spiritual power. One of the most curious examples of medicinal cannibalism was the use of mummy powder. The idea of using mummies as medicine traces back to the 12th century, when Europeans began raiding tombs in Egypt. They discovered the mummies, and for some inexplicable reason, believed that the preserved bodies had magical healing properties. The belief was that the ancient, dried flesh of a mummified person, if ground into a powder, could cure a wide range of ailments, from bruises to fever. So, what did Europeans do? They didn't just leave these ancient remains where they belonged, they ground them up and started selling them as a medicine. The demand for mumia, as the powdered mummies were called, was so great that Egyptian tombs began to run dry. And, naturally, some clever opportunists turned to grave robbing to keep up with the demand. Bodies from European cemeteries were stolen, ground into powder, and sold as a cure-all for various diseases. This isn't some twisted myth, either. There are recorded cases of people buying mumia at pharmacies, where it was sold as a legitimate product well into the 18th century. Yes, you read that right. The sale of powdered human remains was sanctioned by medical professionals and considered an acceptable treatment for centuries. But the practice of cannibalism as medicine didn't stop with mummy powder. Let's talk about some of the other grisly medicines that were prescribed to the ill. One particularly popular treatment in medieval and Renaissance Europe involved eating human liver. Liver was thought to have special healing properties, especially for those suffering from various ailments of the liver itself. In fact, there were medical texts from the time that recommended eating the liver of executed criminals for a range of illnesses. And it wasn't just the liver, other parts of the human body, such as bones, were also ground up and consumed in powdered form as a treatment for everything from epilepsy to paralysis. Now, you might be thinking, surely there must have been some sort of outcry about this practice. Someone must have questioned the morality or sanity of consuming human flesh. And you'd be right to think that. Some did question it, but not enough to halt the practice altogether. In fact, some of the biggest proponents of medicinal cannibalism were highly respected doctors and apothecaries of the time. Paracelsus, one of the most famous physicians of the Renaissance, was known for his somewhat unconventional and controversial practices, which included the use of human body parts in medicine. Even the esteemed medical texts of the time, such as the Merck Index, a widely referenced medical encyclopedia, listed human flesh as a legitimate medicinal ingredient by the 17th century. The practice had become so normalised that cannibalistic remedies were used for a variety of ailments, and many of these gruesome treatments were prescribed in mainstream European medical practice. Think about that for a moment. The medical establishment was in on it. The very people who were supposed to heal you were the ones recommending that you consume human flesh. Of course, as you can imagine, this practice wasn't without its controversies, but the demand for medicinal human body parts didn't abate until the 18th century, when the development of modern medicine and the rise of more ethical medical practices began to push back against these barbaric traditions. But for centuries, European medicine had embraced some truly shocking practices, from the ingestion of human blood to the consumption of mummified bodies. But let's take a step back and consider what all this says about the human desire for control over life and death. It's as if, by consuming the flesh of the deceased, people believed they could somehow cheat death itself, capture the essence of life, and by doing so, restore their own health. There's something strangely human about that desperation. The lengths to which people will go in order to prolong life or to stave off illness is nothing short of extraordinary, even if those methods seem utterly bizarre and horrifying in hindsight. In fact, as we continue to explore the long history of cannibalism for medicinal purposes, we see that it wasn't just about survival or desperation, it was also about power. Consuming human flesh was often tied to ritualistic practices and notions of divine power. The belief that eating the flesh of the dead could make one more powerful, more connected to the divine, or more in tune with the life force is a theme that resonates throughout human history. In many ancient societies, the consumption of human flesh was not just a medical practice, it was a spiritual one. At the heart of this strange and chilling chapter in medical history lies the belief that death and life were more closely intertwined than we might have thought. And even though we now look at these practices with horror, they were once seen as legitimate ways to heal. What we see as a grotesque and macabre practice was, in the minds of people in medieval and Renaissance Europe, a profound attempt to manipulate the forces of life and death in order to survive. The body, both in life and in death, held a kind of mystical power that could be harnessed for good, or so they thought. But now, as we look at this strange and unsettling history, we must ask ourselves, what does this say about us today? Are there practices that seem normal to us now that future generations will look back on with the same kind of horror we feel when we consider medicinal cannibalism? Only time will tell. Alright, we've made it through a rather dark chapter in history, but before you drift off into the oblivion of sleep, let's dive into another fascinating, yet unsettling chapter of cannibalism, the cultural cannibalism that was not only accepted, but encouraged across various parts of Europe. And no, I'm not talking about the odd, isolated incidents from centuries ago that we might expect. Instead, I'm talking about a much broader and longer-lived tradition, the idea that cannibalism could be a part of rituals, and even held in reverence. If you thought that things couldn't get any darker than turning human remains into medical powders, you're in for a wild ride. Europe, and particularly certain parts of it, had a tradition of ritualistic and ceremonial cannibalism that spanned centuries. That's right, cannibalism wasn't always seen as a sign of desperation, nor was it confined to survival situations during sieges or famines. In fact, there were times when consuming human flesh was seen as something far more noble, or at least socially acceptable. Let's start with the most famous though. Frankly, most horrifying example of ritual cannibalism in Europe, the so-called feasts of the dead. Now, I know what you're thinking. What, people gathered around and parted with the corpses of their loved ones? Well, not exactly, but there were certain practices, particularly in medieval times, where it was believed that the consumption of human remains was not just beneficial to the body, but spiritually uplifting. Think about it, if ancient peoples thought that consuming human flesh had magical properties when it came to curing ailments, it wasn't much of a stretch to imagine they might believe it could help with connecting to the divine, or to honour the deceased in a more tangible, physical way. One of the more famous examples of this comes from the Fore people in Papua New Guinea, though outside of Europe. It offers a good comparison. These people practiced funerary cannibalism, where they consumed the body of the deceased in an act that they believed honoured the dead and helped ensure their spirit's safe passage into the afterlife. They didn't just eat any old corpse, mind you. They selected the bodies of people who had passed away, naturally often elderly members of their tribe, and would ritually prepare the body for consumption. This was a communal event, and the act of eating the deceased was believed to symbolise the merging of the living with the dead, ensuring that the spirit of the deceased lived on within the tribe. Now let's bring this concept back to Europe, where we might not have been consuming dead relatives in quite the same way, but where similar symbolic cannibalism was practiced. Take, for example, the Viking funerals. While not strictly cannibalistic in the traditional sense, some of their burial rituals involved the sacrifice of humans or animals, and in some cases, these sacrifices would be consumed. The Norsemen, with their belief in Valhalla and their honour-based society, often used ritual sacrifices to appease the gods, seeking divine favour in battle. These sacrifices were meant to ensure the afterlife of warriors, and eating the body, often in the context of a feast, was seen as a way of honouring the spirit of the deceased and integrating their strength into the living. However, this form of ritualistic consumption doesn't solely belong to the more barbaric or warrior-based cultures. It extended into Europe in various other ways. For example, human blood was not just an item to be consumed by criminals or epileptic patients in certain parts of medieval Europe. The consumption of blood was considered an act of communion. In the true sense of the word, the Catholic Church, despite its historical stance on the sanctity of the body, engaged in what could be called a form of cannibalism with the practice of Holy Communion. During Mass, the wine was said to transform into the blood of Christ, and believers were required to drink it. Now, this wasn't necessarily a form of literal cannibalism, at least not in the biological sense, but it certainly played on similar themes. There was the belief that by consuming the blood, symbolic or otherwise, of someone divine, you would draw closer to the divine, just as medieval physicians believed in consuming actual human flesh for similar magical effects. But let's get back to the more grisly, real-world forms of ritualistic consumption. We have to talk about the use of human bones in religious ceremonies. Yes, you read that right, bones. And it's not just about someone trying to get a little bit of spiritual power from their deceased loved ones. Oh no. Sometimes bones were ground into powder and used to create holy relics. Monasteries and religious leaders across Europe often kept relics of saints and martyrs, which sometimes included human bones. These bones were said to have miraculous healing powers, and it wasn't uncommon for believers to pay for a small piece of a saint's relic to hang in their homes or be worn as jewellery. The bones of saints were revered, and, in some cases, entire bodies of these revered figures would be displayed for the public to venerate, sometimes even consumed by the faithful who believed that doing so would bring them closer to holiness. Historians still argue whether such acts were truly considered forms of cannibalism. Some claim that they were more symbolic than anything else, an effort to honour the deceased or to elevate one's spiritual standing. Yet, the line between spiritual symbolism and actual flesh-eating becomes increasingly blurry when we examine the lengths people went to in consuming these relics. At the heart of these practices, though, was a deeper belief that death and consumption could be spiritually intertwined. You might think this is some ancient superstition that was eradicated when rational thinking came to the forefront of European thought, but it didn't disappear easily. Even as the Renaissance dawned and medical science started to distance itself from these superstitions, the belief that consuming human parts could imbue the consumer with some form of divine or supernatural power lingered in some circles. There are even some accounts from the 17th century of wealthy individuals purchasing authentic body parts from executed criminals for ritualistic consumption, believing they could obtain their strength, wisdom, or courage. The bizarre thing is, many of these practices persisted despite mounting criticism from moral philosophers, scientists, and religious figures. By the 17th century, some were beginning to push back against these practices, calling them barbaric and uncivilized, even within the medical community. Voices were beginning to rise in protest, especially as the Enlightenment era began to question and challenge centuries of unscientific beliefs. Yet, it wasn't until the 18th century, when modern medicine started to really gain ground, that the true practice of consuming human flesh as a medicine or religious rite began to fall out of favour in Europe. So, while you might think of cannibalism as something that belongs in the shadows of history, practiced only by isolated tribes or in extreme cases, the reality is that it was once not only widespread across Europe, but was even accepted in some of the most respected circles of society. As crazy as it sounds, human consumption was for centuries a part of life, not just as a last resort, but as an accepted part of certain rituals and even medical treatments. Looking back now, we may scoff at these practices, but perhaps there's a deeper lesson here. Maybe it's about the lengths to which people will go when they feel desperate, when they need healing or power, or when they're trying to appease the divine. Cannibalism, at its core, is about survival. Yes, but it's also about something more complex. It's about the blurred line between body and spirit, between life and death, and between what we can consume and what we can never truly understand. Let's be honest, cannibalism, while widely considered a taboo topic today, was not just a shadowy act relegated to desperate survival scenarios or the odd cultural ritual. No, there was a time when it was considered a luxury. Of sorts, yes, you read that correctly. In fact, some wealthy Europeans used to pay top dollar for human flesh, whether in the form of blood, bones, or for a particularly premium experience. Finely prepared mumia. Welcome to a world where the elite's appetite didn't just stretch to fine wines and caviar, but also to, well, something far more sinister. And we're not just talking about medicinal cannibalism here, either. This was the strange, unsettling world where human remains were sought after as exotic luxury goods, regarded with a level of reverence that's hard to wrap our modern minds around. By now, you're probably beginning to realise that cannibalism wasn't always about starvation or fear in the 16th and 17th centuries. Mumia, that is. Finely ground up bits of mummified human remains was considered a cure-all for various ailments, ranging from epilepsy to fractures. It was believed to have miraculous healing properties, and so it didn't take long before mumia became a commodity in the European marketplace. However, there's a key element to this gruesome practice that you might find bizarre. Mumia wasn't just harvested from any mummies, it was often stolen from ancient Egyptian tombs. Yes, in their desperate hunt for new sources of this miracle cure, enterprising European traders went as far as to steal mummies from Egypt to grind them into fine powder. This wasn't some fringe practice either. It became a booming trade. Think about it. People were literally paying good money to consume human remains, believing it would cure everything from bruises to brain fever. But when the demand for mumia became too much for Egyptian mummies to supply, European thieves started digging up graves closer to home. They began robbing local cemeteries to create their own stockpile of cures. The sad irony here is that the dead bodies that had been painstakingly preserved for millennia were sold off and turned into a grisly medicine, while the very same people who were using them for their healing powers would never have considered this act as cannibalism to them. Consuming mummified human flesh was an almost elevated act, one that could improve your health or keep you in good standing with the gods. Now, I can already hear some of you asking, but how could anyone actually want to eat or consume human remains? It's an uncomfortable question, I know, but you have to understand that in Europe during this time, the distinction between natural and supernatural was often blurred. People were far more likely to see human flesh as something that could be part of a larger cosmic order, a sacred element that could be used to heal, transcend, and connect to the divine. And yes, as uncomfortable as it may sound, the rich and powerful weren't the only ones indulging in the mumia craze. You see, there was a rather strange and widespread belief that consuming human blood, fat, and bones, whether for medicine or religious reasons, could imbue the consumer with vitality and strength. Imagine someone buying a vial of powdered mummy or a packet of human bones, thinking it would somehow make them healthier, more powerful, or even spiritually enlightened. It sounds absurd today, but for a large portion of European society during the Renaissance and early modern periods, this was simply business as usual. Of course, as more and more people began to question these bizarre practices, the practice of consuming human remains began to lose its favour. Still, there were those who held on to the belief that these sacred rituals were integral to maintaining a healthy, prosperous life. They believed that, in some cosmic sense, consuming human remains could restore balance, be it in the body or the soul. However, by the time the 18th century rolled around, medical professionals began to speak out more openly against such practices. Modern science had started to assert itself as the authority on medicine, and with that came a sharp decline in the use of human flesh as a remedy. But let's not let the story stop here. By the 19th century, a new form of cannibalism was on the rise in Europe. This time, however, it wasn't about using human flesh for healing or spiritual purposes. It was more about the extremes that some would go to in order to achieve pleasure. I'm not just talking about strange delicacies or macabre dinner parties. I'm referring to the twisted phenomenon that cropped up during the late Victorian era, the consumption of human flesh as an extreme form of sexual fetishism. Now, if you think things can't get any more disturbing, buckle up. During this period, there were individuals who would engage in violent and sexual acts that involved the consumption of human flesh, often in very private, secretive settings. These were not widespread practices, but they certainly captured public attention, adding to the growing intrigue and taboo surrounding human cannibalism in the media, whether it was in the form of illicit acts between consenting adults or gruesome criminal cases that dominated the press. The darker corners of society became fascinated with the idea of human consumption, specifically as a way to exert control, dominate, or experience heightened pleasure. What makes this chapter particularly unsettling is that these acts of consensual cannibalism were sometimes romanticised in certain underground cultures. They were woven into certain forms of literature and art, capturing the public's imagination. It was a grisly, dangerous trend that remained largely hidden, though reports of such incidents still surfaced sporadically. But no matter how twisted or perverse these acts seemed to modern society, they reflected an even darker, more primal human instinct, the need for ownership over life and death, the raw desire to consume and control another person. Still, the long-standing taboo around cannibalism held strong in most circles. The 19th century saw more scrutiny of these practices, and the very notion of human consumption began to be viewed more as a symbol of societal decay rather than something that could be normalised. Laws were enacted in many European countries to curb such practices, and as modern ethics and medical science further distanced themselves from any belief in the benefits of consuming human flesh, these grim practices began to fade into the annals of history. But let's return to the concept of cannibalism in more ancient times. Before it became a matter of debauchery or fetishism, let's consider the role of cannibalism in the early days of European civilization, where it wasn't just an isolated practice, but a part of something larger, the consumption of human flesh as a sign of respect. Yes, in some early European societies, eating human flesh wasn't just a practice used to honour the dead, it was a social function, a shared experience that built bonds and connections between the living and the deceased. In some tribes and cultures, eating the flesh of fallen warriors or revered elders was a way of honouring their strength and courage. It was believed that by consuming a warrior's flesh, one could absorb their power and bravery over time. These practices were codified into specific rituals, with the body being carefully prepared and served as part of a larger ceremony. In these cases, cannibalism wasn't seen as a grotesque thing. It was a solemn, ritualistic act that symbolised the continuation of life and the merging of spirit between the living and the deceased. Historians still argue whether these practices were truly widespread or limited to specific, isolated cultures. Regardless, the concept of consuming human flesh as a means of spiritual connection and cultural reverence remains one of the most disturbing, yet fascinating, aspects of European history. So here we are, cannibalism. Once a powerful and integral part of certain European traditions, has come a long way from those early days. Today, it's largely taboo and barely mentioned except in historical analysis or dark fiction. Yet the fact remains that for centuries, people in Europe practiced some form of cannibalism for reasons ranging from medical to spiritual, from celebratory to downright disturbing. By the time the 19th century rolled around, cannibalism was no longer seen as a sacred rite or a medicinal necessity, but instead became something of a dark, macabre relic of the past. However, that didn't mean it disappeared entirely. In fact, the age of exploration and colonial expansion brought a new, more sinister chapter to the story of human cannibalism. Now, cannibalism wasn't being practiced by a select group of spiritual followers or wealthy elites seeking miracle cures. No, it was now something that colonial powers and explorers began to associate with the people they deemed as savages. This narrative was part of the larger process of dehumanization that accompanied the imperial conquest of Africa, the Americas, and the Pacific Islands. This is where the idea of cannibalism as a barbaric trait really takes off in European history. When European explorers and traders ventured into the unknown corners of the globe, they came across indigenous tribes with unfamiliar customs, and it didn't take long for the notion of cannibalism to be thrust into the public eye. Many of these explorers and colonizers had little understanding of the cultures they encountered, and in some cases, they were eager to cast judgment. Cannibalism, as it turned out, became an incredibly useful tool in portraying the indigenous peoples as barbaric, primitive, and inferior. Take the European response to the so-called Caribs of the Caribbean. For example, when Christopher Columbus landed on the islands of the Caribbean in 1492, he came across the native Arawak and Carib tribes. According to Columbus's accounts, the Caribs were known for their cannibalistic ways, something that was probably exaggerated or even fabricated. Columbus's reports to the Spanish crown referred to the Caribs as bloodthirsty savages who would capture their enemies, eat them, and engage in horrific acts of violence. There's a certain irony to this. of course, because Columbus, the man who initiated the European colonization of the Americas, was hardly a paragon of peace and non-violence himself. Historians still argue about whether the Caribs truly practiced cannibalism in the way that Columbus claimed. Some evidence suggests that the practice was either highly exaggerated or entirely invented as a form of cultural demonization. However, this label of cannibalism stuck soon. Anyone from the Caribbean who resisted European domination was labelled a Carib, and the term cannibal entered European vernacular. But here's the dark twist: these savages weren't the only ones caught up in this cannibalistic narrative. By the 16th century, it wasn't just indigenous peoples who were seen as partaking in cannibalistic practices. It was also the European sailors, explorers, and colonists themselves. You see, during the long voyages across the seas, when food stores ran low and provisions were scarce, cannibalism became a horrific form of survival. This wasn't just happening in isolated incidents, it became disturbingly common. Take the infamous case of the Essex, a whaling ship that set sail in 1819. The Essex was struck by a massive whale, leaving it stranded in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, with no food, no shelter, and no hope for rescue. The crew of the Essex was faced with the grim reality that in order to survive, they would need to resort to cannibalism. The men, stranded on lifeboats for weeks, eventually resorted to eating their fellow sailors. Some of the survivors were even forced to draw lots to decide who would be eaten. The story of the Essex crew and their desperate struggle for survival became one of the most famous instances of survival cannibalism in recorded history. The details of this story are stomach-churning, to say the least. It wasn't just a handful of men who resorted to cannibalism, it was entire crews, in desperate circumstances, who had no other choice but to turn on one another. And yet, despite the horror of the situation, there were some strange, almost poetic aspects to the cannibalism practiced during these times. It wasn't just a matter of physical survival, it also marked the emotional toll of being isolated, powerless and desperate. When the survivors of the Essex returned to land, they were met with shock, disbelief, and even condemnation. The public was repulsed by their actions, and yet, at the same time, there was a curious fascination with the story, a morbid curiosity that followed the tale for generations. Cannibalism was also seen as a symbol of the complete breakdown of civilization. To partake in it, even in a survival situation, was considered a loss of one's humanity. The 19th century was marked by a growing belief in progress in science, in the superiority of Western civilization, and in the idea that the savage and primitive practices of the past had been left behind. Yet the idea that civilized men could revert to such an uncivilized act as cannibalism served as a chilling reminder of the fragility of civilization. It was as though, deep down, there was a fear that the veneer of civility was far thinner than anyone wanted to admit. In addition to survival cannibalism, there were reports of cannibalism in the context of war. European armies, during their conquest of new lands, often found themselves in situations where the indigenous people, in the face of violence, would resist by any means possible, including cannibalism. The acts of eating the bodies of enemies were often framed in European reports as a grotesque demonstration of savagery. But the truth is more complicated. It's not as though the European soldiers were morally superior. They, too, engaged in violent acts that were just as brutal, and at times just as savage. Think about it. The very same soldiers who went on campaigns to conquer the lands of others were sometimes caught up in cannibalism in a form of ritualistic vengeance, These acts weren't merely about survival, they were also about asserting power. In some cases, it was a means of humbling and terrorizing the enemy, or a way to make a political statement. The act of consuming the flesh of the vanquished enemy, as bizarre as it sounds, had symbolic meaning. Historians still argue over whether some of these instances of cannibalism were exaggerated or sensationalized by the victors in some cases. The stories were used as propaganda to further demonize the indigenous populations, casting them as grotesque and inhuman in the eyes of the European public. But whether exaggerated or not, the idea of consuming human flesh for power, control, or ritualistic purposes remained a persistent part of European colonial conquest for centuries, and, disturbingly, it wasn't limited to indigenous people. It was a practice that was found in the European tradition as well. So, let's take a step back for a moment as we delve deeper into the history of cannibalism. What are we left with? A strange and uncomfortable realization that cannibalism, rather than being a strange aberration of human nature, has been woven into the very fabric of our history, in many more ways than we'd like to admit, whether for medicinal purposes, survival, or ritual. Cannibalism has appeared time and time again as a reflection of humanity's darkest impulses. What's even more disturbing is that, even in the modern day, the legacy of cannibalism lives on in strange and twisted ways. Let's be honest, when you think of cannibalism in the modern world, you probably think of stories like that of the German man Armin Maiwes, who found a willing victim on the internet. Maiwes was later convicted of manslaughter, but his crime, which involved consensual cannibalism, shocked the world in this strange and twisted tale. Cannibalism had moved from a taboo of survival to a fetishistic act, something that, although far removed from its historical precedents, still carried the echo of humanity's darkest desires. In that sense, we see how far we've come, and yet how close we still are to a practice that, for all its taboo and disgust, continues to occupy the fringe of our collective imagination. From ancient rituals to modern criminal acts, cannibalism remains a potent symbol of humanity's capacity for violence, survival, and transgression. As we now step into the 20th century, you might be thinking that cannibalism would be something relegated to history books, a dark shadow of the past, but in reality, cannibalism continues to haunt our cultural consciousness. And not just in the isolated jungles or savage wilds of the world. No, by the 20th century, cannibalism had evolved into a symbol of a much deeper human need of fear and fascination with the ultimate taboo, a literal breakdown of society's order, and a reminder of the primitive urges lurking within. Imagine this: the world is suddenly plunged into a chaotic whirl of world wars, revolutions, and civil strife. In the middle of all this turmoil, when everything seems to be spiraling into darkness, the very idea of eating human flesh takes on a horrifying new significance. It's no longer just a matter of survival or a ritualistic necessity. It's a statement of despair, of degradation, of a complete collapse of civilization. And the unsettling reality is, it wasn't just fictional stories or far-off legends. In certain corners of the world, people were forced into cannibalism for one reason or another, their survival dependent on it. Take the infamous story of the Siege of Leningrad, a period of 872 days during World War II, when the Nazi army surrounded the Russian city. Of Leningrad, now St. Petersburg, effectively cutting it off from supplies. The citizens of Leningrad, with their food supplies dwindling, resorted to a horrifying form of survival cannibalism. People didn't just eat the bodies of the dead, some even went as far as to eat pets, rats, and even the leather of their own shoes, with starvation and malnutrition claiming thousands of lives every day. Cannibalism became an agonizing, final means of survival for those desperate enough to cross that line. Imagine for a moment the mental toll this takes on the people involved. The sharp descent from a flourishing city filled with culture, art, and history to one where people are willing to consume their fellow human beings. It's not just about eating meat, it's about the erosion of the very principles that bind society together. As tragic as it was, the sheer scale of cannibalism during the siege of Leningrad stands as one of the most grim reminders of humanity's fragility in the face of catastrophe. Yet, the story of cannibalism in the 20th century doesn't end with the great sieges or periods of war. In fact, even in the most peaceful modern societies, cannibalism continued to bubble beneath the surface, lurking in the shadows of psychological horror, moral panic, and pop culture. As we entered the late 20th century, a new generation of individuals began to explore the taboo of cannibalism, not for survival, but for entirely different, more complex reasons. The 1970s brought with it one of the most disturbing chapters in the history of cannibalism, thanks to the infamous case of the cannibal killer. Armin Meiwes, a German man, took cannibalism to an entirely new and bizarre level, one that horrified and fascinated the world in equal measure. You see, Meiwes wasn't a starving man, forced to survive in dire circumstances. He was someone who had a sexual fetish for cannibalism. In a shocking twist of fate, or perhaps fate's cruel irony, Meiwes found a willing partner, a man named Bernd Jürgen Brandes, who shared his desires together. They embarked on a dark and twisted journey that culminated in a consensual act of cannibalism, with Brandes allowing Meiwes to butcher him before consuming parts of his body. This case, while rare and horrifying, symbolises a new and disturbing trend in the history of cannibalism, the fetishization of human flesh. It wasn't about survival or ritual anymore. It was about the perverse attraction of consuming another human being. And in some strange and horrifying way, it became a form of intimacy. Meiwes was arrested and convicted of manslaughter. Though his case sparked heated debates about consent, mental illness, and the nature of human desire, yet this wasn't just about one twisted individual. The 20th century was marked by an explosion of interest in cannibalism, spurred on by horror movies, documentaries, and sensationalized media coverage. Hollywood, too, caught on, making cannibalism a major trope in the horror genre. Films like The Texas Chainsaw Massacre, Cannibal Holocaust, and The Silence of the Lambs cemented cannibalism as one of the most grotesque and fascinating subjects in popular culture. In these films, cannibalism wasn't just a matter of survival or ritual, it became a symbol of madness, barbarism, and a deep societal collapse. It tapped into the primal fear that society could descend into chaos at any moment, and that all of our fragile constructs of morality and law could be shredded, revealing the darkest part of human nature lurking underneath. Cannibalism as a cultural phenomenon was no longer confined to history. It had found a place in the very fabric of modern entertainment, where it was used as a metaphor for the collapse of civilization, the horrors of war, or the breakdown of societal norms. Yet, despite its ubiquitous presence in media and horror films, the reality of cannibalism was still deeply disturbing. The fact that it could be so easily sensationalized and commodified spoke to a larger cultural fascination with the limits of human depravity. In the final years of the 20th century, we begin to see cannibalism take on a more global dimension. As international communication and travel became easier, the stories of cannibalistic acts, often far removed from European history, began to capture global attention. You can't help but recall the infamous 1990s case of the cannibal of Rothenburg, where Armin Meiwes' story was mirrored by a man named Gilberto Valle, a former New York City cop who was caught plotting to kidnap, cook, and eat his victims. Valle's case never went as far as Meiwes', but it echoed similar desires, men willing to give in to the primal urges of consumption, not for survival, but for a perverse thrill. And still, the world watched in horror, torn between fascination and disgust. Were these isolated incidents the acts of a few twisted individuals, or were they indicative of something darker lurking in our society? Historians still argue whether modern cannibalism is a truly rare phenomenon, confined to isolated, often bizarre cases, or whether it speaks to a more profound human impulse, an urge that dates back centuries. On one hand, these cases are often treated as a form of mental illness, an abnormality within the human psyche. On the other hand, we have to ask ourselves whether cannibalism ever really went away. Has it simply been hidden away behind closed doors, only emerging in the rarest of circumstances? Or is it that we live in a world where the taboo of eating human flesh has been so ingrained that it's still seen as a moral line we dare not cross? So, as we close the chapter on the 20th century and move into the 21st, we are faced with a strange question. Have we truly moved beyond the age of cannibalism? Or are we simply better at hiding it? Are we really so different from the people of the past who consumed human flesh for survival or ritual? Or are we just more adept at justifying our impulses, repressing them until they emerge in the darkest corners of our society? One thing is certain: while we may no longer turn to cannibalism for survival, the fascination with it is far from gone. The fact that cannibalism still dominates pop culture, the media, and even rare criminal cases speaks to a deep, unresolved human fear that even in our modern, enlightened world, there might still be something inside us, a desire, a need, a madness that would push us to consume another human being. Whether it's for survival, for power, for pleasure, or just because we can, cannibalism has been, and will likely always be, one of the darkest facets of human history. Now, let's dial things back just a bit, shall we? It's time for a deep dive into one of the most mystifying and unsettling corners of human history, ritual cannibalism. While many people think of cannibalism in the same breath as horror stories or survival tales, the truth is far stranger and, dare I say, more complex than you'd ever imagine. Across history, across civilizations, and through the shadows of time, cannibalism has had an entirely different life. It's been embedded in sacred rituals, acts of divine intervention, and a method for connecting with the gods. Don't worry, I'm not suggesting we fire up the grill and throw on some human ribs for dinner, but in many ancient cultures, the act of consuming human flesh wasn't just the ultimate taboo, it was the highest form of reverence. Welcome to the strange world of ritual cannibalism, where consumption takes on a whole new meaning. Before we dive in, let's think about what cannibalism might look like if it were part of a ceremony, a sacrament of sorts. Imagine this: you're in an ancient temple, surrounded by high priests, chanting and drumming, offering sacrifices to the gods as part of the ritual. The priests prepare food that, shockingly, includes human flesh. Now, while this may sound like something straight out of a horror film, it's far from a fictionalized scenario. Throughout history, various cultures believed that consuming human flesh could bring them closer to their gods, unlock divine power, or serve as a form of spiritual purification. One prime example is found in the practices of the Aztecs. The Aztecs were famous for their human sacrifices, but what is less well known is that many of those sacrifices didn't just end with the death of the victim. The flesh of the sacrificed would often be eaten by priests and nobility in elaborate ceremonies. This act wasn't just about consumption, it was about absorbing the strength, power, and spirit of the victim. It was an act that would bring spiritual benefits to those who partook in the ritual. It was believed that by consuming the flesh of a warrior, for instance, the individual could gain some of their courage, strength, and virility. It's almost as though these rituals were a way of becoming one with the divine forces, a way to embody the very essence of the gods themselves. Historians still debate whether all Aztec rituals involved human flesh, or if only certain elites participated in this particular form of cannibalism. However, what's undeniable is that this was a religious experience, not a simple act of survival. The Aztecs weren't just looking for food, they were seeking communion with the divine. The idea that consuming human flesh could elevate an individual spiritually or physically was widespread. Not just in Mesoamerica, but across various ancient cultures. Take the ancient Egyptians, for instance. No, they weren't munching on their servants, but they did have a particular interest in the concept of mumia, ground up human mummies used for medicinal purposes. Let's pause for a second and take a breath, because this is where the story gets even stranger. Imagine a time when consuming human mummified flesh was seen as a cure for everything from headaches to epilepsy. Yes, that's right, people in medieval Europe, particularly in the 15th century, believed that the powdered remains of ancient Egyptians could heal them. This was the infamous craze for mumia, which, as mentioned, was a type of medicinal cannibalism. But here's the kicker in Europe. When the demand for mumia surpassed the supply of Egyptian mummies, there were only so many to go around. After all, people started raiding European cemeteries for fresh bodies. Think about that for a second. Cannibalism wasn't just something limited to faraway tribes or ancient rituals. It was happening in the heart of Europe in a medical context, driven by desperation and superstition. And it doesn't stop there. This entire concept of human consumption being tied to healing and health continued well into the 17th and 18th centuries. Blood, human bones, and even pulverized organs were believed to be miraculous healing agents. Can you imagine going to the doctor and being told, your blood pressure is high, so we're going to grind up some human bones and drink the mixture? It's almost laughable in how absurd it sounds. But this was a reality for many people in Europe. These strange practices lasted long into the Age of Enlightenment, where the idea of cannibalism, though deeply taboo, was still used for medicinal purposes. The more we dig into these bizarre rituals, the more it becomes clear that, in the past, the boundaries between the sacred, the spiritual, and the grotesque were far more fluid than we ever could have imagined. So, let's talk about the psychological underpinnings of this practice. There is, undoubtedly, a deeply ingrained human desire to push the boundaries of taboo and confront death in a meaningful way. Consuming human flesh, whether in ritual or as part of a bizarre form of medical treatment, was an extreme way of coming face to face with mortality by consuming the body. Ancient peoples believed they could tap into powers beyond their control, powers that might help them transcend the limitations of the physical world. In a way, this was not just about surviving, it was about connecting to the very forces of the universe, about achieving a kind of immortality by absorbing another person's essence. Can we blame them? given the often harsh realities of ancient life. With diseases running rampant and life expectancy on the shorter side. Now, before you think we've entered the realm of fantasy, let's take a moment to think about the moral and philosophical implications of these ancient practices. There was something undeniably profound about the notion that the body could hold power, that consuming it could somehow unlock the supernatural. Cannibalism, in these contexts, was never seen as an act of brutality or barbarism, at least not in the same way we view it today. No, it was seen as sacred, a necessary act of devotion and communion. It wasn't about feeding the body, it was about feeding the spirit, elevating the soul, and crossing over into a higher plane of existence. Cannibalism then could be viewed as an attempt to achieve a sense of immortality or divine protection, not just a primal survival instinct. Let's now zoom out and shift to a much more contemporary view of ritual cannibalism. In the 21st century, as humanity continues to move away from ancient beliefs, it's hard to ignore the fact that there are still vestiges of these primal rituals in modern culture. While cannibalism may not be something practiced openly, unless, of course, your arm in my ways, there are still small pockets of individuals and groups who embrace the extreme edges of ritualistic consumption. Modern practices are, of course, much less common, but they do still exist. For example, there are those who engage in acts of symbolic cannibalism, using it as a form of protest, art, or even sexual fetishism. These contemporary forms of cannibalism are often tied to power dynamics, dominance and submission, and they play out in controlled environments. So, no worries about your neighbours. But this raises an interesting point when we strip away the grotesque and sensational aspects. We're left with the fundamental question: why are humans still so drawn to the concept of eating each other? Is it simply an act of rebellion, a desire to challenge the boundaries of society's norms? Or is there something more deeply rooted in the human psyche, a fascination with death, with the idea of consuming life, and with the power that comes from transgressing that ultimate taboo? Historians still argue whether the prevalence of cannibalistic rituals was more about survival or about a spiritual connection to the divine. The answer is likely a blend of both, with cannibalism serving as both a necessity and a powerful statement. As we close the chapter on ritualistic cannibalism, we find that it's a concept that transcends time and culture, a concept that continues to pop up in unexpected places. Even in our modern world, it serves as a reminder that, for all of our advancements and sophistication, there are still primal urges lurking just beneath the surface, waiting for the right moment to resurface. It also reminds us that the human need for power, connection, and survival can often push us to the extremes, seeking meaning in places most of us would rather avoid. And yet, the practice of ritual cannibalism doesn't seem to be completely behind us. It lingers, a shadow of ancient beliefs and cultural memories, still finding its way into our darkest corners. And so we reach the final chapter in this grisly tale, one that ties together the strands of ritual cannibalism and the enduring human fascination with the macabre. You've made it this far, so I hope you're still sitting comfortably, or, at least, trying to recover from the disquieting facts we've delved into. But as we come to the end of this dark journey, let's take a moment to reflect on what this strange practice tells us about humanity, its relentless pursuit of meaning, and the ways in which we've sought to transcend the mortal coil. Throughout history, cannibalism has taken on many forms, each one shaped by the unique social, political, and religious contexts of its time. whether as a form of survival in extreme circumstances, a tool for social cohesion, or a ritualistic act meant to forge a connection with the divine. The consumption of human flesh was, for some cultures, an important aspect of their worldview, and, if you thought cannibalism was something that only occurred in far-flung corners of the world, think again, because as we've seen, even in the heart of Europe, this strange and disturbing practice found its way into medical remedies and religious rites. Let's pause for a second, if you think about it. Cannibalism, in history, wasn't always the savage, violent act that modern depictions would have us believe. In fact, it was often seen as a sacred, even noble, act, something that could elevate the individual or the community to new heights of power or spirituality. Sure, there were instances where cannibalism was a brutal, horrific act of violence, but, as we've learned, it was also used for spiritual purposes, as in the Aztec sacrifices or the Europeans' strange obsession with mummified flesh. Humans have a long history of using extreme rituals to attempt to control their world or connect with the unknown. Perhaps the most disturbing thing about ritual cannibalism, especially in the West, is how it evolved. What began as a necessity for survival, whether in a famine or siege later, morphed into a widely accepted religious practice for the Aztecs. Human sacrifice and consumption became a key element of their religious belief system. The gods required offerings, and human flesh, particularly the flesh of warriors, was seen as the most sacred offering one could make. Similarly, in Europe, the belief that consuming mummified flesh could heal ailments speaks to a broader human desire for immortality. Mumia, the powdered remains of Egyptian mummies, became a kind of medicinal cure-all. Not only was it believed to be a powerful treatment for a range of illnesses, it was also viewed as a connection to the ancient gods. Even as modern medicine developed and began to distance itself from these superstitions, the fascination with human remains persisted. The idea that human bodies could possess spiritual power was a deeply ingrained belief, one that shaped not only ancient practices, but also medical and cultural views throughout history. Take, for example, the bizarre practices of collecting and consuming blood. Human organs, or even the ground-up remains of human flesh well into the 17th century. There were those who believed that consuming human blood would cure epilepsy, or that ingesting a powdered human liver could remedy a number of ailments. That's not something you typically see advertised at your local pharmacy. Right, so the same ideas held sway in more remote and less documented parts of the world, while many tribes and cultures associated with ritual cannibalism believed in the transfer of life force. Others used human flesh to serve a completely different purpose. In some cultures, cannibalism wasn't about survival or even spiritual connection, it was a means of punishment. The most notorious examples of this are found in the ritualistic cannibalism of certain African tribes, where consuming the flesh of a person who had broken sacred taboos was thought to cleanse the community of its sins. This was, again, a way of restoring balance, a theme that has recurred time and time again in the history of ritualistic cannibalism. But the thread that ties all these practices together is the idea of power. Power over death, power over others, and, in some cases, power over the gods. Ritual cannibalism wasn't merely about consuming flesh. It was about absorbing the power that came with it. It was a direct engagement with life and death, with the living and the dead, and with the physical and the spiritual. Cannibalism allowed humans to confront their deepest fears: death, decay, and mortality, while simultaneously attempting to transcend them, whether in war in medicine, or in sacred ceremonies. Human consumption was a way to connect with forces beyond comprehension. And yet, when you think about it, despite all the horror associated with these practices, there's a kind of strange beauty in the human impulse to find meaning in the darkest of acts, in many ways. Ritual cannibalism was humanity's attempt to impose order on a chaotic world, to make sense of the senseless, and to establish a connection with the divine. In a time before the advent of modern science, before the age of enlightenment, and before the understanding of disease and medicine, humans sought to explain the mysteries of life through rituals and practices like cannibalism. They looked to the heavens for answers, and, in their desperation, they turned to the bodies of the dead. And while it's easy to view these practices through the lens of modern morality, where we see cannibalism as grotesque and barbaric, history tells us that for many cultures it was anything but. In fact, for some, it was a deeply spiritual practice, a means of honouring the dead, and a way of communing with the divine. Think about the Aztecs. For example, their cannibalistic practices weren't just about savagery, they were about honouring the gods. The offering of human flesh was seen as the ultimate act of devotion, an act that would ensure the favour of the gods and the survival of their civilization in their eyes. Cannibalism was less about consumption and more about spiritual unity. Now, in the modern world, we view cannibalism as an ultimate taboo, something that could never be accepted in our civilized societies, and yet it remains an enduring part of our collective imagination. Movies, books, and television shows still thrill audiences with tales of cannibalism, whether in the context of survival stories or horror films. The human fascination with eating other humans hasn't faded. Even though the practice itself has long since been condemned, it's as though we, as a society, need to understand the boundaries of what it means to be human. And cannibalism, whether as a survival tactic or a ritual, challenges those boundaries in ways that make us uncomfortable. But isn't that the point, to push the limits of what we know, to question the sacred and the taboo, and to confront the darkness that exists within every human being in many ways? This dark chapter of human history, ritual cannibalism, forces us to confront the primal aspects of our nature. It asks us to question what we would do in a world where survival was at stake, where the boundaries between life and death were blurred, and where the sacred was inseparable from the profane. Could we, too, find meaning in these rituals? Could we, if faced with the unknown, turn to the body as a source of power and transcendence? Perhaps that's the ultimate lesson of cannibalism. Throughout history, it isn't just about the act itself, it's about the meaning we give it, the power we attach to it, and the ways in which we, as humans, seek to understand our place in the world. As we end this final section on ritual cannibalism, let's pause and reflect on the complexity of human nature. The act of eating another human being may repulse us today, but in the past it held deep spiritual and cultural significance. It wasn't just a survival mechanism, it was a way of connecting with the divine, with ancestors, and with the very forces of life and death that shape our world. The legacy of ritual cannibalism, like so many dark aspects of history, continues to linger in our collective consciousness, a reminder of the lengths humans will go to in search of meaning, power, and transcendence. It may not be a practice that we'd ever consider today, but it's a part of who we are, a part of our past that, like all the most disturbing aspects of history, still speaks to us in whispers across the centuries.